Have you guys heard about the Crusades? You must have. There are so many films depicting the series of epic battles between the Muslim and the Christian forces. Most of these battles were centered around religious sites held in high esteem by both groups. The primary bone of contention between both was the holy city of Jerusalem. So today, we're going to take a look back at history and see how these conflicts unfolded. Let's begin the video. By the end of the 11th century, Western Europe had emerged as a significant power, though it was still miles behind the Byzantines and the Mediterranean and the Islamic Empire of the Middle East and North Africa. The Byzantines were the remnants of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and they too had started to weaken against the relentless assaults of the Seljuk Turks and had even lost considerable territory. After years of chaos and violence, General Alexius Comnenus finally seized the Byzantine throne in 1081 and consolidated his control over the remaining empire as Emperor Alexius I. By 1095, Alexius sent envoys to Pope Urban II, asking for support in the form of mercenary troops from the west to help him face the Turkish threat. Relations between the Eastern and Western Christians had been less than cordial, but the request was sent at a time when the situation was improving. The request was answered the same year at the Council of Clermont in southern France, when the Pope called on all the Western Christians to take up arms to aid the Byzantines and recapture the Holy Land from Muslim control. This was the official declaration of the First Crusades. The Pope's call was met with great enthusiasm, both from the military elite and the common folk. The cross became a symbol for the church, and any who marched with the armed pilgrimage wore the sign. Several religious knightly military orders were set up around this time, including the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, and the Hospitallers. These groups would then go on to protect the Holy Land and the pilgrims who traveled to and from the region. The First Crusade consisted of 4 Christian armies from 4 different Western European regions. They were led by Raymond de Saint-Gilles, Godfrey of Bouillon, Hugh of Vermandois, and Bohemond of Taranto. These armies departed for Byzantium in August of 1096. The religious fervor was so strong that the Fifth Army of less organized knights and commoners, known as the Papal Crusade, set off before the 4 armies. It was led by a popular preacher known as Peter the Hermit. As this army reached Byzantium, Alexius advised them not to move against the Turks until the arrival of the rest of the Christian forces. However, the advice was ignored, and Peter's army crossed the Bosporus in early August. The first ever battle between Muslims and Christians took place at Cibotus and ended in a massive victory for the Turks, who were able to easily crush the invading army. Around this time, another Christian army, led by the notorious Count Amico, carried out a massacre of Jews in various towns around the Rhineland, which drew massive criticism and led to the degradation of Jewish-Christian relations. Finally, the 4 main armies of the Crusades arrived in Constantinople, where Alexius insisted that their leaders swear allegiance to him and recognize his authority over any land taken back from the Turks. All commanders except Bohemond easily took the oath. In May 1097, the Crusade and Byzantine armies combined might attack Nicaea, which was the Seljuk capital in Anatolia. The city surrendered a month later. Despite deteriorating relations between the Crusaders and the Byzantine leaders, the Allies continued to march through Anatolia and managed to capture the great Syrian city of Antioch in June 1098. The next target was Jerusalem, which was then occupied by the Egyptian Fatimans, who were Shiite Muslims and were sworn enemies of the Sunni Seljuks. The Crusade army encamped before the city, and seeing the risk in a devastating battle, the governor of the besieged city decided to surrender within a month in June 1099. The Crusade commanders had promised that no one would be harmed, but all was forgotten when the armies entered the city and hundreds of men, women, and children were massacred as the city was taken. The Second Crusade. The Crusaders had achieved their purpose in a relatively short amount of time, so a majority of the army decided to return to their homeland. The forces that were left established 4 Crusader states in Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. These settlements were meant to provide ease of governance to the conquered land. Each settlement was guarded by formidable castles, which allowed the Christians to retain the upper hand in the region until 1130, when the Muslims started to gain ground in their own holy war of jihad against the Christians, often called Franks. In 1144, the Seljuk general Zangi, also the governor of Mosul, captured Edessa, which was also the northernmost Crusader settlement. Soon, news of Edessa's fall reached Europe, and calls for a second crusade were made. Thus, in 1147, led by 2 great rulers, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany, the Second Crusade officially began. But this time, fate was in favor of the Muslim forces. The Seljuks destroyed Conrad's army at Dorylaeum, an area that had been the site of a great Christian victory in the First Crusade. Despite the earlier losses, the armies of Louis and Conrad were able to meet at Jerusalem, where they decided to march on Damascus with an army of 50,000 men. Rough estimates assume that this was the largest Crusader force in history. Hearing about the impending attack, the ruler of Damascus was forced to call on Nur al-Din, who was Zangi's successor in Mosul. The combined Muslim might proved too much for the Crusaders, and the battle ended in a humiliating defeat for them. The Muslim victory effectively ended the Second Crusade. Nur al-Din added Damascus to his empire in 1154. The Third Crusade. Emboldened by the success in the last series of battles, the Muslims continued to expand their territory. In comparison, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem made numerous failed attempts to capture Egypt. But in 1169, Nur al-Din forces, led by General Shirkuh and his nephew Saladin, seized Cairo and forced the Crusader army to retreat. Upon Shirkuh's death, Saladin assumed control and started to capture land after land. The conquest soon accelerated following the death of Nur al-Din. In 1187, promoted by continuous Christian attacks, Saladin began a major campaign against the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. His troops decimated the Christian army at the Battle of Hattin, following which Jerusalem was besieged by the Muslims. Following a hotly contested battle, the city decided to surrender, and Saladin allowed the residents to evacuate, and it was promised that no harm would befall them. The loss of Jerusalem and other defeats sparked outrage among the Christians, and plans were made to launch the Third Crusade. This was led by the aging Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England, also known as Richard the Lionheart. Unfortunately for Barbarossa, he drowned at Anatolia before his army could even reach Syria. But despite the initial losses in leadership, the Christian force under Richard I was able to defeat Saladin in the Battle of Arsuf. The city of Jaffa was also recaptured, and Christian control was once again established over some parts of the region. Richard then chose to approach Jerusalem. However, he thought against laying siege to the city. Despite some victories, the Christians were still in no position to constantly combat the Muslim forces. Thus, in 1192, Richard and Saladin signed a peace treaty that re-established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and ended the Third Crusade. Interestingly, the city of Jerusalem was still in Muslim hands. The Fourth Crusade. Pope Innocent III called a Fourth Crusade in 1198, but by this time, power struggles between the Byzantine and Europe had broken down the relations between the two Christian powers. This divide motivated the Crusade forces to topple the reigning Emperor Alexius III and instead bring his more docile and friendlier nephew, Alexius IV, to power in mid-1203. However, the new emperor's attempts at bringing the Byzantine Church closer to that of Europe were met with stiff opposition, and by early 1204 there was a palace coup and Alexius IV was strangled. This angered the Crusaders, who declared war on Constantinople. Declaring war on a major Christian city was unprecedented and drew much criticism. But the events that followed would be even more horrifying. The Crusader armies laid siege to Constantinople in 1204, and in April began their assault on the city. All the initial attempts were rebuffed, as even the weather seemed to favor the defenders. But 3 days later, the weather changed, and soon Venetian ships near the Golden Horn managed to come close to the city wall. Armored knights were able to penetrate the city walls, and so began the sack of Constantinople. The Crusaders vandalized, looted, and terrorized the city for 3 days. All sorts of pieces of art and statues were either stolen or destroyed. Despite their oaths and threats of excommunication, the Crusaders systematically destroyed everything they laid their hands on. The holy structures were desecrated, including the tombs of previous emperors. Women, including nuns, were raped, as Crusaders even sacked churches, convents, and monasteries. The once beautiful Byzantine capital now lay in ruins. This marked the end of the Fourth Crusade. Throughout the remainder of the 13th century, multiple crusades took place, but instead of fighting the Muslims, they were aimed at everything which was considered an enemy to the Christian faith. The Albigensian Crusade was aimed at rooting out the Cathari sect of Christianity in France, while the Baltic Crusades were supposed to root out the pagans present in Transylvania. There was even a crusader movement named the Children's Crusade, when thousands of children vowed to march to Jerusalem. Historians, however, do not regard this as a proper movement, as they never reached the Holy Land, and there were questions of whether the movement was made up of children or not. The Fifth Crusade was put in motion by Pope Innocent III before his death in 1216. Crusader forces attacked Egypt from both land and sea, but they were easily rebuffed by the forces of al-Malik al-Kamil, the nephew of Saladin, in 1221. In 1229, the Sixth Crusade began when Emperor Frederick II was able to add the city of Jerusalem to Crusader territory through negotiations with al-Kamil. But the treaty expired a decade later, and Muslim forces once again occupied Jerusalem. From 1248 to 1254, Louis IX organized another crusade against Egypt, but that too proved to be a failure for the Christians. As the Crusader power started to sizzle out, another dynasty came to power in Egypt. The Mamluks were descended from former slaves of the Islamic Empire. In 1260, Mamluk forces in Palestine managed to halt the advance of the Mongol horde, a task many thought impossible. Under the rule of Sultan Baybars, the Mamluks demolished Antioch in 1268. In response, Louis organized the Eighth Crusades in 1270. The aim was to aid remaining Christian states in Syria, but the forces were diverted to Tunis, where Louis died. Edward I of England took another force in 1271, but they accomplished very little, and this is considered to be the last significant crusade to the Holy Land. In 1291, Accra, one of the last remaining Crusader cities, fell to the Muslim Mamluks. This marked the end of the Crusaders and the Crusades themselves. Although the church attempted to carry out many expeditions, most of them were either met with failure or a lack of support, and by the 16th century, support was at an all-time low. Furthermore, the power of the papacy took a hit following the rise of the Reformation movement. The effects. Ultimately, the Crusades ended with a Muslim victory and defeat for the Europeans. However, the Crusades did extend the reach of Christianity and Western civilization. The power of the Roman Church significantly increased following the end of the Crusades, and the Pope's position was significantly elevated. Trade and transportation increased throughout Europe, which resulted in the shipbuilding and the manufacturing of various supplies. A heightened interest in traveling throughout Europe following the Crusades is thought to have paved the way for the Renaissance. Among Muslims, the Crusades were seen as immoral, bloody, and savage. The ruthless and widespread massacre of Muslims, Jews, and non-Christians created a permanent rift between the two civilizations, and even today, Muslims refer to Western involvement in the Middle East as a crusade. Whatever the case, the Crusades did increase global connectivity and brought into contact great civilizations. So that's all the time we had today, folks. Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to view more of our amazing videos, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to let us remain updated about all our activities. Till next time, adios.